Three siblings stood together in silence, their young faces filled with questions they couldn't yet ask. A stranger appeared at their mother's grave, holding the key to a secret that had been buried for years. Their hearts raced as they learned something that would change their lives forever. A past they never knew existed now seemed to stand before them, leaving them wondering, who was this man, and why had he come now? Let us know where you're watching from. Thank you for joining us on this Heartline journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Matthew, Grace, and Oliver stood hand in hand, their small fingers clutching each other tightly. The April morning was quiet, except for the faint rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. The three siblings were dressed in their best clothes, though none of them wanted to be there. Today was the day they said goodbye to their mother, and everything felt heavy, like the air was thicker than usual. Their Aunt Margaret had been taking care of them since their mother's passing. She whispered kind words to them as they approached the gravestone, but they barely heard her. All their thoughts were on their mom, a loving woman who had always told them stories at bedtime, packed their lunches with notes of love, and made them laugh on even the worst days. The gravestone was simple, with their mother's name carved neatly in gray stone. The flowers they had brought looked too bright against the somber background. As the triplets stood there, each of them remembered different moments with her, how she helped Grace make her first painting, how she cheered for Oliver at his soccer game, how she hugged Matthew when he scraped his knee. But as they looked at the grave, they noticed someone standing a few feet away. He was a man they had never seen before, wearing a dark jacket and holding a small bouquet of lilies. He looked at them with a softness in his eyes, but there was also sadness in his expression. Aunt Margaret seemed startled when she saw him, her hands tightening on her bag. The man walked closer, his steps slow and careful. He didn't seem scary, just unfamiliar. He crouched down to their level, placing the flowers gently on the grave. The triplets stared at him, confused. Who was he? Why was he here? Then Aunt Margaret's voice cracked as she said, "This is Michael, your father." The triplets blinked, unsure if they had heard her correctly. Their father? How could that be? They had never known they had a father. Their mother had never mentioned him. Michael looked at each of them, his eyes filled with something hard to describe. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, like regret mixed with hope. Grace took a small step closer to him, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Matthew and Oliver stayed where they were, trying to make sense of what they had just learned. Aunt Margaret placed a hand on their shoulders, steadying them. Michael spoke softly, though his words didn't seem to reach the triplets. Instead, they stared at his face, searching for answers. Did they look like him? Was he really their father? 1,000 questions swirled in their minds, but none of them could find the words to ask. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photo. He placed it on the gravestone. The picture showed a younger version of their mother, smiling brightly, with Michael standing next to her. She looked happy in the photo, and the triplets couldn't help but wonder why this man had been missing all their lives. The triplets stayed silent, their young minds racing. For the first time in their lives, they began to realize how little they really knew about their family. The triplets stood frozen, their young minds trying to untangle the whirlwind of emotions. Grace, ever the curious one, reached out toward the photo on the gravestone. Her small hand hovered over it, hesitant, as if touching it might reveal answers to the many questions swirling in her head. Michael watched her, his gaze steady. yet filled with an unspoken plea for understanding. Oliver clenched his fists at his sides. He wasn't sure if he was angry or just confused. Everything felt wrong. His mom had always been enough for him, for all of them. Why hadn't this man been there before? And why did he show up now, when it was too late? Matthew, on the other hand, studied Michael quietly. Unlike his siblings, he often thought about the things their mom didn't say, the blank spaces in their family story. He had noticed how she sometimes looked sad when she thought no one was watching. Was this man the reason? Matthew wasn't sure how to feel. Aunt Margaret stayed close to them, her presence like a buffer against the uncertainty. She knew this day was going to come sooner or later, but she had hoped it wouldn't be at a time like this. She looked down at the triplets, their faces so much like their mother's, and then back at Michael. There was history here, unspoken and heavy. Michael lowered his head as if the weight of their stares was too much to bear. The moment stretched on, the silence punctuated only by the gentle rustling of leaves. The triplets felt the air grow colder, or perhaps that was just their imaginations. None of them knew what to do. Should they run? Should they ask questions? Should they trust him? Grace finally broke the stillness. She didn't say a word but picked up the photo and held it close, staring at the image of her mom's younger, happier self. The man in the photo, Michael, looked different. He seemed less burdened, less tired. She glanced up at him, then back at the picture, and then at her brothers. Matthew and Oliver exchanged uncertain looks. None of them had expected this day to reveal such a big secret, and none of them knew what it meant for their future. Would Michael stay? Would he leave again? Could they even believe he was their father? As the triplets stood there side by side, the weight of the unanswered questions began to settle on their small shoulders. The triplets stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing against their young hearts. Grace clutched the photograph tighter, as if it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. Her brothers stayed close, watching Michael warily, unsure of what to make of this stranger who claimed to be their father. Michael's expression shifted, his sadness deepening. He didn't try to move closer. Instead, he looked at the ground, as though searching for words that wouldn't come. Aunt Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "This isn't the time for all the answers, Michael," she said, "but they deserve to know, to start somewhere." Matthew felt a strange pull in his chest, a mix of curiosity and frustration. He wanted to demand why their father hadn't been in their lives, why their mom hadn't told them about him. But he didn't know how. Instead, he let his gaze wander back to the gravestone. The carved letters of their mother's name seemed sharp and cold now, not the warm, comforting presence she'd always been. Grace lowered the photograph, her eyes searching Michael's face. She couldn't say anything. Her throat felt tight, like words were trapped there. Oliver shifted his weight from foot to foot, his mind racing. He wanted to grab his siblings' hands and pull them away, but he didn't move. Something kept him there, rooted to the spot. Michael cleared his throat and spoke for the first time, his voice soft but strained. I I never wanted to leave," he said. His words seemed to float in the air, hanging there like unfinished sentences. The triplets didn't know whether to believe him, but none of them could look away. Aunt Margaret stepped forward, putting herself slightly between Michael and the children. "We'll talk," she said, her tone firmer now. "But not here. Not like this." The triplets exchanged glances. Their aunt's voice was steady, like a rock they could hold on to in the swirling confusion. Grace let out a tiny breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Matthew looked at Oliver, who shrugged faintly. None of them knew what the future held, but all three felt the weight of the moment shift slightly, as though the ground beneath their feet wasn't entirely solid anymore. As the triplets left the graveyard, Aunt Margaret guided them toward her car, her hand resting gently on Oliver's shoulder. Michael followed behind at a slight distance, his steps slow and hesitant. He seemed unsure of how to act, as if each movement might disturb the fragile balance of emotions surrounding them. Grace kept glancing back at him, her mind churning with questions she couldn't voice. The photograph was still clutched in her hand, its edges now crumpled from her grip. She didn't know why, but she felt like it was the only thing connecting her to the man who claimed to be their father. Matthew walked quietly, his head slightly lowered. He was deep in thought, trying to process everything that had just happened. He wanted answers, yet he didn't know where to start. His mother had always seemed so full of love, yet there had been moments when he could tell something was missing. Now he wondered if Michael was the missing piece. Oliver, on the other hand, felt restless. He didn't like the feeling of uncertainty, and he didn't trust this man who had appeared out of nowhere. He kept his distance from Michael, staying close to Aunt Margaret as they reached the car. Once inside, the triplets sat together in the back seat. Aunt Margaret glanced at them in the rearview mirror, her expression soft but serious. Michael climbed into his own car parked nearby, waiting for Margaret to lead the way. Grace's fingers traced the edges of the photograph, her curiosity growing with each passing minute. She wanted to know more about the man in the photo, about her mother's life before she had them, about the secrets that had been kept hidden. But she also felt afraid. What if the truth changed everything they knew about their family? The car ride was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the engine. Matthew stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. He could see Michael's car in the distance behind them, and his mind wandered back to the graveyard. He wondered why Michael hadn't come sooner. Why now? Oliver crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat. He didn't like the way his siblings were acting, as if they were curious about this stranger. In his mind, their mom had been all they needed, and he didn't want anyone else stepping into her place. Aunt Margaret turned onto the road leading to her home. The triplets had lived with her for weeks now, and while it wasn't quite the same as living with their mom, Margaret had tried her best to make them feel safe. As she parked the car, she looked back at them. "Come on, kids," she said softly. "Let's go inside." The triplets climbed out, their steps slow and uncertain. Michael's car pulled up behind them, but he didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The triplets watched as he finally stepped out, carrying the same hesitant air he had at the graveyard. Margaret guided the children inside while Michael lingered near the doorway. The house felt warm and familiar to the triplets, but the presence of a stranger made it feel different. Grace placed the photograph on the table, staring at it for a moment before looking up at Michael. She had a feeling this was just the beginning. The house felt smaller with Michael standing in the doorway. Grace, Matthew, and Oliver gathered together, unsure of where to sit or what to say. Aunt Margaret stood nearby, watching them carefully, her eyes flicking between the triplets and the man who had suddenly appeared in their lives. Michael took a deep breath and stepped inside, his movements hesitant. He seemed out of place in the cozy home that had become the children's refuge. The triplets stared at him, their expressions a mix of confusion, curiosity, and skepticism. Grace's gaze lingered on the photograph she had placed on the table, her fingers lightly tapping its edge. Matthew sat down, crossing his arms as if he were trying to shield himself from the emotions swirling around the room. He wanted to ask so many questions, but the words felt stuck somewhere inside him. Why had Michael stayed away? Why hadn't their mom told him about him? Could he be trusted? Oliver chose to stand, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. He wanted nothing to do with Michael, and he wasn't afraid to show it. To him, the man was a stranger, not someone who belonged in their lives. He kept glancing at the door, half hoping Michael would leave and never come back. Grace, however, felt the pull of curiosity growing stronger. She couldn't stop staring at the photograph, her mind racing with questions. Why did her mom look so happy in the picture? What had happened to change everything? She looked up at Michael again, wondering if he had the answers she was searching for. Aunt Margaret cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. "Let's sit down," she said, her voice calm but firm. She gestured toward the chairs around the table, and the triplets hesitated before following her lead. Michael took the farthest seat, as if he were trying to keep some distance between himself and the children. As they sat, the triplets felt the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The table, usually a place for meals and laughter, now felt like the center of something unfamiliar and unsettling. Grace's fingers stopped tapping the photograph, and she glanced at her brothers. Matthew looked uncomfortable, while Oliver's expression was a mix of anger and unease. Michael looked at the triplets, his gaze steady but filled with regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Aunt Margaret watched him closely, waiting for him to say something. The triplets stared back at him, their young faces showing a mix of emotions, too complex for words. Finally, Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another photograph. This one was smaller and older, its edges frayed with time. He placed it on the table, next to the one Grace had brought. The triplets leaned closer, their curiosity momentarily outweighing their uncertainty. The photograph showed their mom holding three tiny babies, her smile bright and full of joy. She looked younger in the picture, and the triplets recognized the faint resemblance to themselves. Michael stood beside her in the photo, his hand resting on her shoulder. He looked different, happier maybe, but the triplets couldn't understand why things had changed so much. Matthew felt his chest tighten as he looked at the photograph. He wanted to know why their family had been broken apart, why their mom had been left to raise them alone. But the questions felt too big to ask, too overwhelming to put into words. Grace's curiosity deepened as she studied the photo. She saw something in her mom's eyes, a light that had been missing in recent years. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a longing to understand the life her mom had lived before they were born. Oliver glanced at the photograph and quickly looked away. He didn't want to see it. To him, it felt like a reminder of something that had been taken from them, something that couldn't be fixed. He crossed his arms tighter, his frustration growing. The triplets sat in silence, their emotions too tangled to express. Michael watched them, his regret evident in the way he held himself. He wanted to explain, but he didn't know where to start. Aunt Margaret placed a hand on the table, her presence steady and reassuring. The moment stretched on, the air heavy with unspoken words. The triplets knew this was only the beginning of the story, one that would take time to unravel, one that might change everything they thought they knew about their family. As Michael and the triplets sat together, the weight of the past lingered, But so did the promise of something new, a chance to piece together their broken family, one moment at a time. Questions remained unanswered, emotions hung in the air, and yet the seeds of hope had been planted. Thank you for joining us on this Heartline journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The future holds mysteries waiting to unfold. What would you do if faced with such truths?